So before we dive into some of the fundamental core elements of what makes a story work, we're going to look at some broad essentials that are necessary for any story to resonate with an audience. And a lot of these might seem kind of like common sense to you, but I think it still bears worth saying at the start of this lesson plan to get us started off on the right foot. So the first thing to keep in mind is that you have to have a personal interest in the story you're telling. Whether you're telling a story or writing, if you're not invested in it, you cannot expect your audience or your listener to be invested in it either. So make sure when you choose a story to tell and share that it's something that matters to you and that you're invested in what you're saying. Because if you are, that will come across. And if you aren't, that will also come across. So keep that in mind. Personal interest in what you're saying, very important. There's a great Kurt Vonnegut quote, pity the reader. At least it's attributed to him. I'm sure a lot of people have said this, and it's a great thing to keep in mind when you're writing or telling a story. Essentially, consider how your story is going to be perceived by your audience and why your audience should care. You don't have to have a fully fleshed out answer to this, but just starting to think of the way your story will be perceived by others is going to make you a better storyteller, because we've all had those encounters with people who will talk on and on about themselves forever, and we have no interest in what they have to say because they aren't thinking about us. They're just trying to impress instead of express. So make sure you think of how your story will be perceived by your target audience, by whoever you're speaking to. And just keeping that in mind is going to bring your story to life in different ways beyond what you might expect. Relevance to larger context. In other words, make sure you have a point in what you're saying. So if you're for in a job interview, for instance, and you're sharing a story about a trip you took to Costa Rica, unless that's relevant to an answer to a question you're giving or to a question that's been asked, it's just going to be random and out of the blue and out of context, and it's not going to do you any favors. So make sure, whether you're writing a story or not, there should be some relevance to a larger context. There should be a point to what you're saying in what you're writing. Similarly, keep in mind a perspective that communicates something about yourself. So we talked about this earlier. You want to look at stories from the point of view of how it has shaped you or what you took out of it, as opposed to simply stating what happened. So make sure you're keeping that in mind as you're telling a story. What does this mean to you? Why is it worth telling to you? How has it changed you or given you a different opinion or outlook? Or simply just what's your angle on what's happening? As well, think of the perspective that it contributes to the broader situation. So this is the relevance to the larger context as well. What perspective are you bringing into a conversation or into a greater dialogue? If you're talking with someone, how is your point of view going to enhance the conversation or express a different side of yourself? So these are all just kind of background things to make sure you have in mind to think of how the mechanics of your story are going to come into play. Make sure you're seeing it from all angles, and this will just give you a good handle on more or less just knowing what you're doing, knowing why you're telling the story you're telling, and why you're writing it. And on that note, it's worth mentioning that some stories are just inherently interesting or fun or entertaining, and that's totally okay. I think with this and with a lot of stuff we're going to cover, it's really easy to overthink things. And that's not what I want you to do at all, because sometimes a story is just funny. Sometimes a story is just great and fun. You don't have to hit all of these marks, you just want to share something that you think is interesting. And if it matters to you, if it's interesting to you, then it's going to be interesting to your audience as well. So that being the case, keep all of this in mind. Keep the point you're trying to make, the relevance to the larger context in mind. But if it all comes down to I'm sharing this story or writing this story because I love it and it's hilarious or it's super interesting and worth sharing, then there's nothing wrong with that. Go for it. But just starting to think about these things is important to make sure that your stories are going to have the biggest impact that they can possibly have, because that's going to put you in control of the telling. So with all of that being said, we're ready to head to the next lesson.